For years, America, and indeed the entire world, looked at Whitney Houston and saw something that defied the laws of human nature. They saw perfection. They saw a voice that felt less like a human instrument and more like a celestial force. A smile that was surgically placed on every magazine cover to signal grace, royalty, and an untouchable kind of holiness. For a long time, the image of Whitney Houston was treated as an untouchable, sacred sanctuary of pop culture. But beneath that fortress of glamour was a woman who was slowly, methodically, being suffocated by her own success. To understand how we got to the end, we have to understand the construction of the miracle. In the early 1980s, the music industry was a different landscape. It was segregated, divided, and looking for a crossover miracle. Enter Clive Davis and Arista Records. When they found Whitney, they didn't just find a singer, they found a prototype. Whitney came from a lineage of gospel royalty, the daughter of Cissy Houston, the cousin of Dionne Warwick, the goddaughter of Aretha Franklin. The talent was genetic, it was undeniable, but the industry didn't want the raw, soulful Whitney from the Newark church choir. They wanted a universal symbol. Clive Davis meticulously engineered her image to be non-threatening to white suburban America. Her hair was styled, her repertoire was curated to be pop-heavy, and her every public utterance was scripted to maintain a mask of discipline and purity. By the mid-80s, she was the princess of pop. She was the gold standard. But this perfection was a cage. Industry insiders from that era now admit that Whitney was not allowed to explore jazz or R&B that was considered too black for the mainstream charts. She was a product designed to be consumed by everyone, which meant she could belong to no one, not even herself. This is the psychological foundation of the tragedy. Before she ever met Bobby Brown, Whitney Houston was already living a double life. She was a woman of deep, soulful complexity playing the role of a two-dimensional porcelain doll. By the time 1989 arrived, the pressure of maintaining this mask was reaching a boiling point. The world saw a superstar at her peak. Whitney saw a prisoner in a gown. This brings us to one of the most misunderstood moments in music history, the 1989 Soul Train Music Awards. The narrative often claims that Whitney was corrupted by Bobby Brown, but the facts suggest something entirely different. Whitney Houston didn't meet Bobby Brown at her lowest point. She met him when she was at the absolute zenith of her power. Bobby Brown was the antithesis of the Whitney Houston brand. He was the bad boy of R&B. He was loud, he was aggressive, and he was unapologetically himself. He didn't care about crossover appeal. He didn't care about polished images. When they met, the spark was not just romantic, it was subversive. For Whitney, Bobby Brown represented freedom. He was the first person in her professional life who didn't look at her as a brand or a symbol. He looked at her as a woman. In later interviews, Bobby described their first meeting as immediate and electric. There was no strategy, there was no PR calculation, there was only a raw, terrifyingly real chemistry. Whitney did not choose Bobby Brown because she was broken. She chose him because she was suffocating. He was her oxygen. He was the only part of her life that felt real in a world made of cardboard and hairspray. But the world and the industry could not forgive this choice. To the public, it wasn't a romance. It was a betrayal of the princess image they had bought and paid for. In 1992, Whitney reached a level of fame that arguably no artist has ever matched. The Bodyguard soundtrack didn't just sell albums, it became a global cultural phenomenon. I Will Always Love You became the anthem of an era. But as her professional success became astronomical, her personal life became a battlefield. In July of that year, she and Bobby married. The wedding was a massive $11 million spectacle, but the media coverage was already dripping with venom. The tabloids were already writing the script of their disaster. Every argument was analyzed, Every rumor of drug use was amplified. What the public failed to see was the impossible paradox of Whitney's life. On one hand, she was the national treasure who sang the Star-Spangled Banner at the Super Bowl, a performance so iconic it defined American pride. On the other hand, she was a woman struggling with the sheer weight of her own fame. The industry demanded that she stay the princess, but the world she now inhabited with Bobby was one of raw emotion, escalating conflicts, and the beginning of a dangerous dependence on substances to numb the noise. According to those close to her during the mid-90s, substance use didn't begin as a party habit. It began as a coping mechanism. It was the only way to silence the voices of the millions of people who felt they owned her. When she was high, the pressure disappeared. When she was high, she didn't have to be the voice. She could just be Whitney. But proximity to Bobby Brown, who had his own struggles, created a feedback loop. Their habits, which might have been manageable in isolation, became a destructive, self-reinforcing cycle when they were together. As we move into the late 90s, the story shifts from a private struggle to a public execution. The music industry is built on a work until you break philosophy. As long as Whitney could still hit the notes, the cracks in her personal life were ignored by those who profited from her. But as soon as those cracks began to affect the bottom line, the narrative turned. By 1999 and 2000, the warning signs were flashing red. She missed a performance at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. She was reportedly fired from the Academy Awards rehearsals because she was unable to sing. The media didn't respond with concern, they responded with ridicule. The very industry that had built her perfect image was now the first to profit from its destruction. This leads us to the year 2002, a year that would permanently scar her legacy. The 2002 interview with Diane Sawyer remains one of the most painful pieces of television history. It was watched by millions, but it was understood by very few. By this point, Whitney was physically thin, defensive, and clearly under immense strain. When she uttered the infamous line, "Crack is whack," she wasn't just being defiant. She was trying to protect what was left of her dignity. In her mind, admitting to using a cheap drug like crack was beneath her status. She was still trying to play the role of the queen, even as her throne was burning. But the world didn't see a woman in a psychological crisis. They saw a punchline. They saw a fall from grace that they could laugh at. The interview didn't lead to an intervention. It led to a total loss of public sympathy. Whitney was no longer the princess. She was the tragic joke. What was lost in the laughter was the reality of her humanity. Whitney was denying her vulnerability because, in the world Clive Davis built for her, vulnerability was a career killer. She had spent 20 years learning that she was only valuable as long as she was perfect. So when perfection was gone, she felt she had no value at all. By 2003, the relationship with Bobby Brown had devolved into a series of documented police calls and domestic disturbances. In December of that year, police were called to their home in Alpharetta, Georgia. Whitney had visible injuries to her face. Bobby was charged with battery. To the public, this was the final proof that Bobby was the villain. But those closer to the situation described a much more complex and heartbreaking reality. It was two people who loved each other deeply, but were both addicted to the chaos that fame had forced upon them. They were two people drowning in a shallow pool, unable to find the floor. The industry, meanwhile, watched. They didn't stop the music. They didn't cancel the contracts. They waited to see if there was one more comeback they could sell. Because in the business of music, a troubled diva is often more profitable than a stable one. As 2004 turned into 2005, Whitney Houston was a shadow of the woman who had captivated the world in the 80s. She was isolated, her voice was beginning to fray from years of neglect, and her marriage, the one thing she had fought the whole world to keep, was finally, irrevocably, tearing her apart. But the most dangerous part of this story wasn't the noise of the arguments, it was the silence that was about to come. This is where the first chapter of our journey ends. Whitney has reached the bottom of her first major collapse. The marriage is failing, the voice is damaged, and the public has turned its back. But the tragedy isn't over. In fact, the most misunderstood chapter, the recovery and the comeback, is where the real damage was done. Because when a legend tries to return to the pedestal the world built for them, they often find that the pedestal was never meant for a human being. It was only ever meant for a ghost. By 2006, the world thought the storm had passed. Whitney Houston had finally filed for divorce from Bobby Brown. To the public, this was the moment of liberation. The headlines screamed about a clean break and a new beginning. But for Whitney, the reality was far more destabilizing. You cannot simply remove a decade and a half of shared chaos and expect peace to fill the void. According to those close to her, the marriage was a source of pain, but it was also a structure, a familiar battlefield. When that battlefield disappeared, Whitney was left in a state of profound, terrifying isolation. From 2007 to late 2008, Whitney entered the quietest and most misunderstood period of her life. She largely vanished from the public eye. There were no world tours, no major televised appearances, and almost no interviews. This wasn't a peaceful retirement. It was a retreat into a dark, emotional fortress. She spent long, stagnant stretches at her home, limiting contact to a tiny circle of family members and security. Documentary accounts from Can I Be Me describe a woman who was emotionally guarded and deeply uncertain about her identity. If she wasn't Bobby's wife and she wasn't The Voice on the charts, who was she? There were attempts at recovery during these years. Whitney entered short-term rehabilitation programs, but they were often brief, surgical interventions designed to stabilize her for the next project rather than heal the roots of her trauma. She would return from these attempts to the same crushing reality: massive financial pressure, unresolved grief for the life she had lost, and an industry that was already whispering about a comeback. This is the psychological turning point. During this period of isolation, Whitney reportedly became obsessed with her own past. She would sit for hours watching recordings of her performances from the late 1980s. She watched that young woman, the one who could hit a high C without effort, and she spoke about her in the past tense. She would ask her assistants, how did she do that? As if she were looking at a stranger. This psychological distance was a warning sign. Whitney was no longer anchored in her present. She was mourning a version of herself that the world still demanded she inhabit. By late 2008, the industry's patience had run out. Silence, from a commercial perspective, is a liability. Clive Davis and Arista Records began the heavy machinery of the return of the Queen. The album was titled I Look to You. On the surface, it was a narrative of faith and survival. Behind the scenes, it was a desperate exercise in studio repair. Producers involved in the sessions later admitted that Whitney's voice was a fraction of what it once was. Years of smoking and emotional strain had decimated her endurance. In the studio, they could hide the cracks. They could select the best 3 seconds of 100 takes. They could polish the tone until it shimmered. When the album debuted at #1 in 2009, the world cheered. They thought the miracle had returned, but the studio had created a lie that the stage would soon have to defend. The 2009-2010 world tour, titled Nothing But Love, was a gamble that turned into a public tragedy. The industry's logic was simple. The album was a hit, and they needed to recoup millions in expenses. But Whitney was not physically or emotionally ready for the unforgiving grind of a global tour. From the opening nights in Australia and Asia, the cracks became visible to everyone. Her voice would fail by the 3rd song. She struggled to hold notes that were once her signature. The reviews were not just critical, they were vicious. Fans in London and Seoul walked out. The media, which had just celebrated her recovery, now mocked her for being out of breath. Behind the scenes, the situation was a nightmare. Members of the touring team described a woman who was reading every bad review, watching every shaky cell phone video of her failing on stage. The anxiety tightened her throat, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of vocal failure. Why didn't anyone stop the tour? The answer is a dark indictment of the music business. There were too many contracts, too many stakeholders, and too much money on the line. Whitney herself, conditioned since childhood to be a professional, refused to quit. She saw her failure to perform as a personal moral failing rather than a medical necessity. When the tour finally sputtered to an end in 2010, there was no sense of accomplishment. There was only exhaustion. Whitney retreated again, but this time the isolation felt permanent. Her financial situation was increasingly fragile. Despite her legendary career, she had enormous debts and a massive circle of dependents to support. The pressure to be Whitney Houston was now a financial obligation she could no longer meet. In her final year, the cycle reached its inevitable conclusion. She appeared occasionally at industry events, but she was a shadow. She was searching for a version of herself that no longer existed in a world that refused to let her be anything else. In February 2012, she traveled to Los Angeles for Grammy Weekend, the very event that had once been her kingdom. The irony was suffocating. Surrounded by the industry that had built her, used her, and then monetized her decline, Whitney was more alone than ever. On February 11, 2012, in a hotel room at the Beverly Hilton, the silence became final. The official cause was drowning, but the autopsy of her life revealed a more complex truth. Whitney Houston didn't die because of a single choice or a single person. She died because she was a human being who was never allowed to be imperfect. She was a woman whose vulnerability was treated as a bug in the system rather than a cry for help. The real tragedy of Whitney Houston isn't how she died, it's that we never let her live. We wanted the miracle, but we didn't want the person. We celebrated the voice, but we ignored the woman behind it. And in those final 48 hours, as she paced those hotel hallways, she wasn't a superstar. She was a tired soul, looking for a place where she didn't have to perform. As the lights go down on this story, the question remains for us. Do we love our legends enough to let them be human? Or do we only love them when they are perfect? For Whitney, the world made its choice too late. The voice is gone, but the lesson remains. Perfection is a pedestal, but it is also a tomb.